Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 70, Pimp by Iceberg Slim. Welcome, Point Blank listeners. My name is Kurt, and joining me, as always, here's Justin.
Hey, Kurt. Hey, listeners. How is everybody doing out there? I know you can't answer, people out there, but Kurt can. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good, Justin. I'm I guess, ready to talk about this book. This is going to be a little bit different for us today.
Yeah.
And normally sometimes in our episodes, we throw out that little warning at the beginning of the episode. In this one, I just want to throw this out right away. We're talking about an autobiography, so this is stuff that really happened. And there is a lot of abuse, a lot of manipulation, a lot of assault in this book that we're talking about today. So if that's something you want to hear about, we're not going to focus on that so much, but you may not want to do anything with this episode. So just going to throw that out there.
Yeah, that I totally concur with that. This is a book that's filled with misogyny, and that's not a lot of people's cup of tea. Hell, it's not my cup of tea. This is an uncomfortable book to try to understand in the way that we like to understand books at Point Blank. But it's not just the content. It's also, we don't really discuss autobiographies as narrative in a crime fiction podcast. So it's just it's interesting on multiple levels how we are going to try to approach this. And I'm curious to see how it ends up going. So that will be fun.
Yeah, well, Justin, I have a feeling this is going to be one of those episodes where we're going to end up offending multiple people, probably. I think we're probably going to offend some people because we're going to approach this as being too political. Then we're going to get other people pissed at us because we're not being political enough. Mm-hmm. And I don't see how we win here. So listeners, please realize that we acknowledge that up front, and we're gonna plow through anyway.
Yeah, this is our most noir episode ever because no matter what we do, we're gonna lose.
That's I think that's right. That said, I mean, it is an interesting book. It is an influential book, and it is a powerful book. And even if what's in there isn't necessarily what the reader may want to read, there is definitely a lesson that Iceberg Slim tries to give us in the closing pages of the book. Before we get to that, Justin, should we jump right into a summary, or do you want to do any more setup here?
Well, yeah, let's do a summary. We're going to have a lot to talk about with this book, but I think it's important before we do that to get a sense of what this book actually is. So I'll dive in. It's going to be a long summary because this book, I mean, it's not incredibly long, but it's incredibly dense. There's so much going on. Every page is just dripping with details about Iceberg Slim's life. He has a photographic memory, and it's very clear he's either the best bullshitter ever, or he's really good at remembering the specifics down to the day of his life as a pimp. So you'll see that as I discuss it.
Well, Justin,
yeah, go ahead.
Justin, before you start with this summary, I know that you read a biography by a scholar who looked into Robert Beck or Iceberg Slim. And I did not read that particular biography, but it's my understanding that through research and through actually putting the pieces together, that most of the events as described by Beck or Iceberg Slim in this book are essentially accurate. Is that correct?
I would say that many of them are, yes. I think that we could claim that this is an autobiography, though at the same time, like any autobiography or memoir, there are going to be things that are embellished or things, no biographer is going to be able to verify whether or not specific details down to the day of who's who and what happens are accurate. But like the big things like the jail time, where he is at certain times during his life. Is he in Indianapolis and Rockford, Milwaukee, then later on in Los Angeles? A lot of that stuff I think is in order, including like the places he went to school and such. So yes, it's not just a pure fable, but I think as you'll see, the specifics of the story, there's got to be some room for, embellishment.
And I wanted to ask that up front because I think that's, as a reader, without looking at the back, I looked at his background like after I read the book. And I feel like some of this does feel like it could just be somebody bullshitting you, basically. But, that putting that into context, that it is essentially accurate, does help me analyze this book. So I think it is important to know that up front, that it has been pretty much shown to be true. And I think that's important because there's something, and I'm going to get to this later, there's something about this writing and also just pimps in general that feels manipulative. And I just, for me, it was kind of important to get that yes, this isn't just a bunch of BS after I read the book. So anyway, why don't you give us a summary and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. Okay, so the full name of this story, this autobiography, is Pimp, A Story of My Life, and it's written by Iceberg Slim. That's a pseudonym for Robert Maupin Beck. He was born Robert Lee Maupin, and then he later changed his name to Robert Beck. Iceberg Slim is his pseudonym and his pimp name, but his actual pimp name is Kavanaugh Slim. So there's so many different names in here, and if you read it, you'll see that yourself. A lot of these people in this story operate by multiple names, and on top of that, Beck made sure to change all the names in this book from real life to protect, the identity of people who are involved in essentially a criminal enterprise. So there's all that. But this book was published in 1967, and it was published by Holloway House, which is a very interesting publisher in that prior to Robert Beck, they didn't publish black literature. They were a company that published a lot of writing by white folks, and then when they saw an opening in the market, the potential for black literature as being lucrative, they sort of turned their attention to it, first with Iceberg Slim and then later with Donald Goines and a lot of black writers from the 70s. And it became an incredibly important publishing house for them, though it wasn't some kind of, like I initially thought. I was like, oh, Holloway House, that's like a beacon of light for black writers. It wasn't actually that. It was mostly an exchange of money for books. But nonetheless, a lot of great literature was produced by Holloway House during this time. As of 1996, Iceberg Slim was the best-selling black author of all time in the United States. So if that's a shock to you, as it's a shock to me, then you're going to be continually shocked as I discuss this book in more detail today, because it's incredible how little I knew about this book and its power over the years until I actually sat down and read through the literature and got to know who Robert Beck was as a person. So anyway, let me summarize this book, and I'm going to start not with my own thoughts, but actually with Slim's actual preface to Pimp, because it really sets the tone, and it helps us to understand why he wrote it, perhaps, and also how knowing why he wrote it changes the reader's experience with it. So let me just read it, and then you'll understand. Quote, "In this book, I will take you, the reader, with me into the secret inner world of the pimp. I will lay bare my life and thoughts as a pimp. The account of my brutality and cunning as a pimp will fill many of you with revulsion. However, if one intelligent, valuable young man or woman can be saved from the destructive slime, then the displeasure I have given will have been outweighed by that individual's use of his potential in a socially constructive manner. I regret that it is not impossible to recount to you all of my experiences as a pimp. Unfortunately, it would require the combined pages of a half-dozen books. Perhaps my remorse for my ghastly life will diminish to the degree that within this book I have been allowed to purge myself. Perhaps one day I can win respect as a constructive human being. Most of all, I wish to become a decent example for my children and for that wonderful woman in the grave, my mother." So this is how he sets off on this incredibly revealing and visceral autobiography. The story opens in 1921 with a 3-year-old Robert Beck experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of a female babysitter. This is in Indianapolis where the story starts, and Beck's living with his mother at the time. Their father, they left behind in Chicago. He wasn't a very good father. According to Beck, quote, "My idiot father had come to the big city and gone sucker wild. He couldn't stay away from the high yellow whores with their big asses and bitch dog sexual antics. what they didn't con him out of, he lost in the cheap crap joints. So that was his opinion of Dad, and that didn't really change much over the course of the story. After a few years and some bad luck, down in Indianapolis, he and his mother come across this man named Henry Upshaw, who's in town visiting family. This is a huge critical moment in the story that is one of the most important moments in Beck's life, it turns out. This man, Henry Upshaw, meets Beck's mother, and they fall in love. And with him, they move back to Upshaw's hometown of Rockford, Illinois. About this man, Henry, Slim writes, "Henry was religious, ambitious, good and kind. I often wonder what would have happened to my life if I had not been torn from him." And in a way, this whole autobiography is about this moment, this fork in the road, where had Robert Beck been able to live with Henry Upshaw and be raised by him, he might have turned out to be a different type of guy with a different kind of life. But we can't know that, and really neither can Robert Beck, but that's his wishful thinking and his, I don't know, is just imagining what would have been different had he been able to stay with Henry. Unfortunately, the situation with Henry is heartbreaking. Henry is in Beck's life for just a short time, but Beck learns how to see the world through Henry's eyes. He works with him. He sees Henry as a huge inspiration. But then Beck's mother ends up falling for a two-timing hustler named Steve, who I think is a pimp as well in Rockford, and she ends up moving with him to Chicago, dragging Robert with them, and then later to Milwaukee. They end up robbing his dad, and this whole situation is just, it's from the moment of great opportunity for Robert with Henry, and then instead he ends up in this situation with a violent, no good hustler in Steve, and this sort of failed relationship with his mother. He sees his mother, who trades Henry for Steve, as having failed him and herself. So at this moment, he decides to, quote, start sopping up this poison of the street like a sponge. And this is the turn toward the life of the pimp. So in Milwaukee, he meets a guy named Party Time, who's a hustler, who's done crime. He's been in jail. He's committed robberies, and he starts to learn a little bit from Party Time about pimping and such. They play a con game called Murphy, where they seduce and trick wealthy white dudes into falling for this con where their money gets taken from them because they're so interested in pursuing black prostitutes that these hustlers essentially set them up to rob them and take their money. And it's a common con at the time, and it's one of Beck's first tastes of living this kind of street life. After that, Beck graduates from high school. He claims he has like a 3.96 GPA, but that biographer actually double-checked that and couldn't find any evidence of that. He didn't have that great of a GPA, but whatever, little embellishments here and there. He gets an alumni from Tuskegee, which is a historically black college in Alabama. He sets him up to go to school there. Immediately, Beck gets into trouble. He gets busted for sneaking off on campus and going to juke joints and sleeping with local women, and then for bootlicking rock gut whiskey into the campus, getting kids drunk. He doesn't end up with a very successful college career. All of a sudden, he's back in Milwaukee, and he gets busted for pimping, essentially. He does his first trick with a gullible young girl, and then he's busted by trying to take that to the next level, and he goes and spends some time in a reformatory in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Slim writes about how his mama was writing at least once a week, and how he was so concerned about the reformatory. It was so stressful that he asked her to put in long distance calls to the warden once a week just to make sure that they knew that somebody was out there who loved him, because he was afraid of dying in there. And that fear was legit, because in one example, his new friend in the reformatory named Oscar gets beaten to death, or near to death, to the point of brain damage by one of the guards. And this is sort of a haunting, recognition of what options are available to black men at the time, and that hasn't really changed. Prison is a hellscape, and it traumatized him, I believe. Not enough to stay out of prison, because he spends quite a few years in prison over multiple sentences, but we'll get to that. So he comes back out to Milwaukee, and he's right back in it. He has this desire to play the pimp game, and he meets this woman named Pepper, who's an older woman relative to his 18, She teaches him sort of the art of sexual pleasure and seduction. And it's around this time he starts doing heavy drugs, first with cocaine. He meets a mentor who starts to teach him about the ways of successful pimping. He gets arrested again, spends another stint in prison at the Waupun State Prison. In prison, that's when he starts to really learn from some of these more expert cons. He gets some good advice, including this nugget, quote, "Always remember, whether you be sucker or hustler in the world out there, you've got the vital edge if you can ironclad your feelings." And this is an important lesson that we see over and over again, and that's one of the reasons he adopts the name Iceberg. This idea that you have to be cold as ice, you have to seal yourself from your feelings, if you have to be ruthless, essentially, if you're going to end up being able to control the women in your life to be successful as a pimp. That's one thing that comes up over and over again. Back on the streets, he ends up going to Chicago. There's some good writing in the middle half of the book, essentially the middle chunk, 50%. There's a lot of good stuff about how he came to be a pimp, the difficulties and challenges of successful pimping. But this is also the most egregiously violent part of the book, as Slim learns how to manipulate and control women so that they can make money for him. Long story short, he builds his stable of prostitutes. He develops a heroin problem. He also comes up with his pimp name, Iceberg Slim. At the 3/4 mark of the book, in that middle part of the book, it's almost like reading Elmore Leonard's Swag, which we read for the last episode. You're watching somebody learn how to do a thing through trial and error until they're successful at it. Like the armed robbers in Swag, we see Iceberg Slim figure out how to be successful at first securing his first woman into his, quote, stable, and then figuring out how to go from there to being the kind of pimp that he envisions for himself, the guy who can drive around in the Cadillac and have all the nice things and be respected amongst the community. This all happens, and then we get to roughly the 75% mark of the story. Slim gets busted by the FBI for pimping. I think it's understood that one of his women rats him out. He was no good to his women. He treated them like crap, and that's not uncommon in this game. But one of them turns on him. The FBI busts him, and he goes to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. When he gets out of Leavenworth, he goes right back to pimping, and then he gets arrested for armed robberies. So he thinks he's good at pimping, but he's also really good at getting arrested. There's that. This time, though, he actually breaks out of jail. And I would say this is one of my favorite scenes in the story. It's an escape scene as he's travailing on the top of this roof at the jail, trying to time it right so he can get away from the guards and get over the wall before he gets shot or caught. So this is an exciting scene. It's very tense, and it's very well written. And that's the thing about Iceberg Slim. He writes well. This is a nicely written book. It's full of rich detail and some incredibly intense and visceral moments. So after this point, he's sort of on the run. So in a sense, he pimps across America. He goes to Indiana. He goes east. He builds a stable in Detroit and then in Cleveland. And then he meets this violent pickpocket named No Thumbs Helen. And she's an interesting character, but she's only in the story for a few pages before she ends up in prison. I will say this. I read this book on Kindle, and on Kindle you can see the public highlights of all the readers. And you can also see the highlights that were or the lines that were most highlighted. Many of them are lines about controlling women, which I thought was interesting. For example, on page 261, this has been highlighted like 500 times. Control is easier and tighter away from a familiar setting. A girl in strange surroundings depends more on her man. And I'm like, what the fuck? Why is this highlighted? I feel like it's either highlighted by a bunch of feminist academics who are trying to understand this book. I highly doubt that that's the case. My fear is that the people highlighting this are young men excited about the prospect of following in the footsteps of Iceberg Slim, but we can't know for sure. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little at the end, but the idea of this book being not a cautionary tale, but actually a how-to manual to pimp and how to treat women, that's the biggest problem with this book that I have, the legacy of it being misconstrued as something that is good rather than something that should be avoided. But anyway, we get to the end of the book. Slim ends up, he's aging, and he realizes that pimping is a game for young people. He heads to LA. He has this yearning to be back to his mama, who now lives out there. But then he travels to Seattle and he's traveling around. He realizes he needs, in order to really get to the next stage of his life, he needs to get rid of heroin. So there's this scene where he goes through heroin withdrawal in Seattle, which is pretty intense. Then he continues to pimp because he just can't get it out of his system. But then he gets busted, goes to prison for the last time. There, it's like the end of the line. He realizes party times died. Somebody had mixed his heroin with battery acid. Some of his old heroes are dying or failing. And then Slim comes to the realization, in this awful cell, he calls it, he's through with pimping and drugs. Pimping was for young men, the stupid kind. So he gets out of prison, and a few months later, he's with his mother while she dies. And that's the end of this section of his life and the end of the book. I would call this a good book. If I was just reading it as a novel, I would say it's good. It's a good autobiography as well. I mean, he pulls no punches. If you're going to write an autobiography where you tell everybody about the worst shit you did, this is a good model, because he doesn't let himself off easy unless you think that what he's doing is good. So I like the beginning of the book. I like the end. If you like learning about the intricacies of the pimping game, the middle half of the book is worth your time, but I can't recommend it for everybody because of the things that Kurt and I have already mentioned about the misogyny and the violence. This is an important book outside of the things that we've said because of its history and its context and its influence. This book isn't mildly influential. It's incredibly influential. It's a shitty book in what it says about women and how those who idolize Slim have used it as a manual for objectifying and controlling women, but it's also the model for the blaxploitation film era of the 70s. It's one of the primary inspirations for a lot of early hip-hop and gangster rap. It's a book that fueled the pens of dozens or hundreds or thousands of black writers in the 70s and 80s all the way up to now. This guy is incredibly important, and this book is what made him important. I do like Slim's later in life commitment to black liberation and the Black Panthers. I like that he fought to preserve his own bodily autonomy as a pimp and later as a writer. I mean, this is a guy that outside of his years in prison, he learned how to control his own destiny. And this is a hard thing to do as a black man in the United States, free from the control of white society. He carved his own way, and he did so successfully. If only he had been able to do this without taking away the bodily autonomy of the women he hustled. That's the catch. Overall, I'd give this a 4 out of 5 for the writing, for the power of the story, and for its influence. But I'm sure we're going to have a lot to say on this book, and I'm curious to see what you think, Kurt.
Well, Justin, thank you for that summary, and a little longer summary than normal. And I think that's important because of just like you said, the huge scope of what this book is. As far as a rating, this is the hardest book I've ever had to give a number to on this show. And I think ultimately I'm going with a 4.5 because Beck can write. I mean, he can write. He has the power to tell a good story, and he has the power to move you, maybe, as I said earlier, maybe in a way I don't want to be moved, but I'm still moved. So, but that's still powerful writing. I'm also giving it a 4.5 because of how influential it is in capturing this portion of American history. And I also think that's one thing that you didn't mention in the summary, and something I had to return to multiple times while reading this, is this feels like a more modern story than it is.
Yeah.
A lot of this book is taking place before World War II. And a lot of what it's describing, it feels like it should be, I don't know. If I didn't know that and I was just told these events, I feel like it would be set in the 60s or the 70s or something like that. And maybe that's in part because Beck is actually sitting down to write the story.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's important. So for its capturing of this portion of 20th century American history, I think it captures something that very little literature of the time was doing. Now, for a listener of this show and a crime fiction fan, I don't know. I'm not sure how I would rate it if that's how you're approaching this book. But if you're looking for a book about the history of street literature, about the Black American experience, then this rating goes way up. My short review is that Iceberg Slim is an asshole who can write. Iceberg Slim becomes less of an asshole a little later in life, but he's still kind of an asshole. But the point is, he can write for the purposes of this, of our show. But yeah, no, this is an interesting book, and it's as you mentioned in your summary, and it's a difficult one to work with here, for a lot of different reasons. But
well,
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you want to break this apart, Justin, and kind of piece out a little bit more of what's going on here?
Well, one thing that's challenging about this book is that because it's an autobiography, typically when we do these podcasts, we go, let's focus on the text, and then later we'll talk about the author. The author is important to the piece of writing that we're discussing, but we got to separate them a little bit when we're focused on the actual craft and the narrative, etc. In this case, the autobiography is about Slim's life, and Slim's life continues after Pimp. And so we've ended up watching, there's a Ice-T helped to produce a documentary about Robert Beck, Iceberg Slim. We both saw that. I read the biography written by Justin Giffords that chronicles his life from start to finish. And this book is just a selection just pulled out from his life, but his life continues, and it's really hard to separate the author from the material. So I feel like we should just talk about Robert Beck however we're going to talk about him. This book is part of it. This establishes legacy, but right after this book, he wrote Trick Baby, and then like Mama, Black Widow or something, and he had fame from all of these books. Like I said, he sold maybe 1 million copies of Slim, but he sold many hundreds of thousand copies of the other books too. So he came to fame in the 70s on the back of all of these books, and they all matter, and it's just a continuation of his post-life. Once he essentially quit pimping in his 40s and tried to like straighten up and live the married life. One thing I wanted to mention, while he's trying to find his way into the world of writing, he sat down to write this book with the help of his wife, who said, dude, tell your story. These stories are wild. So he would sit down and write it. He wasn't just living off his coffers from his pimping days. He was working as a pesticide salesman and an exterminator in Los Angeles. He would go out during the day and kill rats and roaches and stuff, and then he would write at night while raising 3 daughters and a son. So he went from what's conveyed in this story, vicious, controlling, rough, violent, drug-fueled street life, to living this relatively quotidian life as a like lower middle class exterminator with a family. It's just a bizarre contrast, and it's just amazing that he got out of this life at all, unlike a lot of his inspiration. We didn't mention the guy named what's his name, Big Boy or something, I forgot, but there were several people from his early life that they didn't make it. You don't survive this game, but he managed to be able to pull that off and live to tell the tale.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting point about the writing here, is that at the time, a lot of the authors that we've talked about who either have a biography written about them or write some kind of autobiographical work are writers who write that towards the end of their life, where he is writing about an experience that happens before he becomes a writer, and then all of his other writing happens after the autobiography. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, and I think we really do need to give, and a lot of people do give credit to Betty. Is it Betty Shue? Is that how you pronounce her last name? Shue. That was his wife at the time that they wrote Pimp. That she is a co-collaborator in this. She's really it's pretty clear that he would not have started to write had she not told him, hey, you need to get this story down. And she helped tremendously with doing the typing, probably doing a lot of the editing, and encouraging him to get this to a publisher. So I see a lot of sources that list her as a co-collaborator and a collaborator with Iceberg Slim, and essentially a co-creator of the Iceberg Slim persona, which was really created when he wrote this. It's not coming from before the writing of Pimp. So I did find that part a little bit interesting.
So this isn't a novel, and therefore the characters in this story, they're real people, or they're at least permutations of real people. We have Iceberg Slim, which is essentially Robert Beck from his early days up until his pimping days. His pimping days occurred between like 1940 and 1960. So that's where much of the story takes place. And then it's 1961, 1962. That's when he's in his 40s. He has his last stint in prison. He gets out. His mother dies and he marries Betty, and then he tries to live the straight and narrow. There's complications in his later life, to what extent did he live the straight and narrow? You hear his daughters talking about, some of them say he wasn't on the up and up, he was still living this life on the side. There's a lot of debate about that. But the heart of the story is about him between 1940 and 1960, living this life and then rendering it in an incredible detail in this book. His mom was hugely influential to him, especially in the way that he crafts her. I mean, even though this is autobiographical, you have to craft the narrative so that it resonates right with the reader. So his mom, he starts with the mom. He starts with how the mom was important and then how she failed him by leaving Henry Upshaw. And then you see him, he's like the prodigal son. He leaves for the streets. He falls into pimping and drug abuse. And it isn't until his mom's on her deathbed, essentially, that he is compelled to emerge and sort of atone for this behavior. I mean, he talks about his mom in the preface. He wrote this in like a loving memory of her. So I think she's an important character in this book, and she's an important symbol for what he lost and what he regained when he returned to her right before her death. The other character, Henry Upshaw, I mean, I loved this character briefly, and it was just so crushing, that whole beginning with Henry Upshaw and this possibility of finding a real home, roots, connections in a black community in Rockford, a place where Robert Beck could have found the right kind of substrate to grow into an upstanding citizen, so to speak. Do you have any thoughts about him or about a couple of the other key characters at the beginning?
Well, I do think you're right that the setup is important, because he does return to this in the end of the book. But you see throughout, particularly his teenage years and these characters that he's interacting with, he is certainly exposed to people, very good people and very bad people. And he's given multiple opportunities to choose a path. And many people would probably say, well, he went down the wrong path. So he's toying with that throughout, I think, especially at the time that he's writing this book, is he's going back to these decision points in his life. And something that he calls basically street poisoning is what happens to him, and why he justifies the decisions that he made in his life. And that's essentially these bad actors either shutting out or closing off the opportunities that the good people in his life had given him. That, I think, is kind of an interesting part of the lesson, essentially, that I think Beck is trying to get to with this, at the end of this book anyway, is that a lot of the things that the way his life worked out can essentially be boiled down to this street poisoning that happened to him as a youth. And as you said, I think that's interesting in how he sets it up at the beginning part of the book. Then we have the roller coaster ride of his life that goes on. And then we see him sort of, I mean, it's not quite midlife, it's a little bit past midlife, but kind of midlife, reflecting on these choices that he made as a younger person. So yeah, that I would definitely agree that setup and those early characters are certainly much more important. And in a way, he dwells on those characters earlier in a way that he doesn't dwell on the people in his life in the middle of the book.
That's a good point, because one reason I didn't talk a lot about the middle, other than the violence, is the fact that there weren't that many characters that were developed. It just felt like a kaleidoscopic roller coaster of characters and actions that weren't necessarily building a narrative structure. It was just, here's pimping on this day, and then this day this shit happened, and then the next day there was some more shit that happened, and then 3 weeks later, this woman came into my life and this one left, and it was just managing the day-to-day of running a business. So there wasn't any arc or wasn't any movement other than the movement of being a pimp. And those characters, the names of these people, there were a dozen people, but none of them really stuck out to me at that time. I think he really took a lot of time to develop these role model and mentor characters at the beginning, from Henry to Pepper, who taught him about sex, to Party Time, who taught him about the basics of living as a street hustler, and then a couple other key mentors before he really came into his own and played the game. It's after that's when he comes back to developing characters and thinking about the people from the beginning. It's really nicely crafted. I mean, I'm not sure if this was Robert or maybe this was part of Betty's hand in saying this thing needs to have a little bit more shape. How do you give this story the shape it needs to feel like a nicely contained piece of writing? And that's where the craft comes to play. This idea that for whatever you want to say about this book, question whether it's true, whether it's embellishment, whether it's exploitation, whether it's not, it's strongly written and it's good hard-boiled prose. As hard-boiled writing, there's some incredible, like, Chandler-worthy descriptions and similes in this story. There's a lot of incredible imagery. There is poetic stuff happening throughout this book, visceral street stuff, violence, drug abuse, the way humans communicate with each other. There's dialect stuff. There's a whole glossary dedicated to this book because there's so much slang in this book that obviously the Holloway people, these old stodgy white guys, they're like, I can't understand half of what you're saying. But in fact, the glossary is actually quite useful because now it's dated slang on top of being the slang of the street that not everybody was accustomed to. So there's so much interesting shit that happens in terms of just pure language in this book that puts it above a lot of people would call mediocre street literature. It's certainly not that.
Yeah, and in the you alluded to this documentary that we watched, but the full name of it, should you want to watch it, is Iceberg Slim Portrait of a Pimp. And that's a pretty good, like, synthesis of Beck's life overall, not just Pimp. So I would recommend looking at that if you're interested in this topic. But in that documentary, the author, Kwan, I think it's Foye, he calls this, what Beck can do is there's beautiful pictures using ugly paint. And I think that's a pretty good way of describing his writing. I'm not sure, sometimes I might argue if it's a beautiful picture, but it's a good way to synthesize Beck's style of writing.
Yeah, it's good writing. It's worth visiting for that, or if you're just interested in seeing how language was being used in the streets during this time. I mean, as crime fiction enthusiasts, most of our fans are, this was the era that Chandler was writing too. And, well, not the writing, but the setting, the time that this story took place. A lot of the classic golden age of hard-boiled detective writing was happening here. But here we get this through the prism of the Black Street experience. A lot of this take isn't often portrayed in a lot of the works that we've discussed from dudes who were, for the most part, white writers.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Justin. That's kind of what I was getting at when I was sort of reminding the readers of what time frame this is occurring in, because this is that experience of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s predominantly. And I think that's also what's interesting about this compared to some of the contemporary authors that we've looked at who are writing in that period, is that this guy's telling his life in this way, using this language, and it feels way more modern than somebody who is writing a book supposedly, in the early 50s, say, and it's supposed to be set in the early 50s. And I read that now and it feels dated. It feels like something I'm reading that is old. Whereas in Beck's work, reading segments, I mean, some of this does feel dated, but there are portions of it that, aside from certain bits of slang or whatever, if you just told me this, I could conceive of these events happening today. That's a different way of capturing the American urban experience than we see in these traditionally white crime fiction authors from these eras. So I think that's an interesting point to contrast, and I'm sure there's probably some scholar out there who's done that, because there is a fair bit of academic writing that has been done on Iceberg Slim. I picked up an article by B.D. Graham titled Negative Glamour, the Pimp Hero in the Fiction of Iceberg Slim. And this author describes it as urban gothic, a bus station confessional. That sort of rings a bit true.
Yeah.
It does capture America with certainly a different voice and a different experience that we see in other bits of crime fiction.
And it's true. This writing is very alive. It doesn't feel dated. It feels like it's almost screaming off the page. And it's an incredible addition to the hard-boiled experience of the mid-century from a writer who is seeing it from an angle that is less commonly in print. So it's an incredible gift and a historical document capturing a time and a place that could have easily been lost had he not married Becky or had he overdosed on heroin, to name two examples.
One of the things, Justin, that was talked about in the documentary that we watched was, the mention that you can essentially flip to any page in this book and get a sense of a good quality writing. And I was wondering if that was an experiment you might want to do with this book.
Like literally open the book right now and do it?
Yeah, I have it in front of me. You could call out a page if you want.
Yeah, let's do that.
Give me a number.
117.
117? All right, here we go. Shit, he probably wouldn't know you if he saw you again. He wasn't salty with you for turning down the freak off. He was playing strong con on his white whore. He's got his whores thinking he's God. Even a square from Delaware should know God ain't going to kiss your ass when you tell him no, you poor boob.
I mean, it's so alive.
It is, yeah.
It's rich.
We could try that.
It's poetic. Yeah, let's do it. 212.
212. Let's see what we get. All right. How about not the first paragraph? Let's go. Let's kind of grab something in the middle of the page here.
Okay.
I'm going to do 2 paragraphs because these are very short.
Sounds good.
I got a cab to one of my stuff connections. I was going underground. I had to have at least a piece of stuff. I had copped and was walking down the street looking for a cab. I passed a barber shop. I got a glimpse of a white spattered dogs of a joker in a barber's chair next to the window. I thought, geez, that square joker is pitiful. He ain't hip spats went out with high button shoes.
There we go. Slang dense and full of rhythm.
Yeah, and I do think that is something I certainly noticed in this book throughout. There is a pretty solid quality of writing, or caliber maybe is a better word, of writing throughout. It doesn't really let off at any particular time.
Yeah, some books do wilt. Writers get tired, especially in that middle part. But yeah, the writing is consistent all the way through. It's really alive, and it almost feels like cocaine fueled or Kerouac like intensity to the writing,
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense too about the legacy of the book, of why it's very heavy in street slang and lingo, and it really coming out of the same generation, or a lot of the things of beat poets and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And its legacy, it makes a lot of sense why this particular author, this particular work would be embraced by early hip hop and rap culture, because it makes a lot of sense. It's words from the street spoken the way that they're spoken. Let's put that to music, and there you go.
Yeah, and the pimp culture, there's an up and down history to it. And of course, pimp culture isn't something from the Black American experience. There's a long history. The word pimp goes back to the 17th century. The French word pimper means to dress elegantly. There is a idea of it being around over the course of multiple generations in Europe and in the United States, but then it sort of got reclaimed by African-American male culture in the 1970s and became this thing in large part due to this book. This book really brought it to the attention of folks as an idea of, an alternative way of existing in a society that doesn't create opportunity for Black men. There's a lot of rebellion and resistance in this culture, which makes it so attractive. So I understand that, and I can appreciate that aspect of it. Of course, there's the flip side is that by liberating oneself, by pursuing a culture that objectifies and controls women, you're putting the shackles on somebody else, and that's the problem. But the actual desire to be carving out one's own path in a city that doesn't give a shit about you, that allure is incredible, and hip-hop has capitalized on that by telling these stories, some of them legit true stories about the difficulties of life in the streets, some of them more fabricated because there's the fakers and then there's the real stories. But the legacy of that, hip-hop and gangster rap as a cultural, as a global phenomenon, there are a few things as important and as universally understood and recognized as being valuable culturally as that movement. And to think that all essentially came from this book, that just it's almost mind blowing.
Yeah, and maybe we're overselling that a bit, but I don't think so based on the the interviews we saw in that documentary. But I do think, and this maybe gets into a little, says we are getting towards the end of the episode here, a little bit of the more critical analysis of the legacy here. And you mentioned this with the bits that are highlighted about the manipulation of women. But in this piece that I mentioned, Negative Glamour by B.D. Graham, they point out this idea, they're talking about the black pimp here, is that the freedom and slavery reversal is crucial. The black pimp escaping from bondage becomes the slave owner. Thus, Iceberg, thinking of his desire to dominate the woman, quote, I want to be the boss of her life, even her thoughts. I got to con them that Lincoln never freed the slaves. And that's page 104 of Pimp. And also this idea, and this is something that conflicts with Beck's own activism with the Black Panthers and Black liberation, is that the pimp, and this is from Graham again, quote, the pimp is essentially a capitalist. He makes money by wit, manipulation, and exploitation. Beck's metaphorical extension of pimp in his essays makes this clear. In his other short essays, Beck makes a comment about Nixon, and this is going back to Graham. Nixon is a pimp whose stable of whores is his cabinet. Even writing Iceberg's new straight profession is, quote, pimping on paper. And that is, again, from an interview with Beck himself.
Some of these quotes you mentioned, some of these ways of trying to encapsulate this idea of pimping and this take on what it means. I think of pimping as capitalist realism. I think of it as one of these things that if you can't beat them, join them. If we're all fucked and we're stuck in this state where we can only think selfishly and we can only think in terms of how much we can accrue, rather than thinking in terms of cooperation or trying to find some kind of solidarity, this is where that thinking leads. If you can't beat them, join them. Let's find a new avenue to find success. And even if we're doing that on the backs of others, at least it's not on my back. At least I'm not the one who's getting fucked. And I can see the compelling nature of that, but sadly, that's such a limiting take on how to get by. Obviously, there are better ways to get by if you can figure out how to organize those ways and think through those ways. But a lot of times people aren't put in positions where they get to pick and choose what options are available to them to lead a fulfilling life. In fits of desperation, you work as a wage slave for a shitty boss, or you try to carve out your own existence, but you end up hurting people in the process. That's what this story is about, hurting people to find your way through life. The Black Panther part of this is the interesting part. Beck wasn't just a pure capitalist at heart. He didn't just go, I want to make as much money as I can and buy 50 yachts, and that's the end. He did have that ethical backbone. He did see the Black Panthers as struggling for a genuine black liberation. He had that in him. And so that's the turn in this that makes him maybe not fully redeemable, but you see that his intent in all of this, or maybe at least in his later life, he understands, he still has that aspect to his thinking and his way of seeing the world that is incredibly, profound and important. And I can't say that he ever recognized deeply, that this idea of oppressing women for profit was absolutely wrong. Maybe he thought it was morally wrong, but did he truly believe it in his bones? I'm not sure if he ever sat down and said, holy fuck, I can't believe I ever did that. But at the same time, the Black Panthers were regularly criticized for being misogynist too, as were many radicals in the 60s. A lot of these movements were shaped and formed and led by men. So, this question of sexual liberation wasn't even a mainstream thing into the 60s and 70s. So it's a very interesting time of change, capturing this moment, thinking about him writing about this in the 60s, and then 10 years later, the shit blew up everywhere. Black liberation, women's liberation, LGBTQ liberation. Cultural shift was so massive that it changes the way we are able to think about and look at all of this stuff in a way that I can't even imagine how I would see this stuff in the 1950s. I'm not sure what lens I would have had at that time,
Well, and you're right that what does Beck reflect on, later in life is an interesting question. But, when we've mentioned this a good number of times that people look at Pimp as a manual sometimes, and that's pretty concerning. But Beck does mention at the end of Pimp, and I'm going to read a section here. This is when he's sitting in jail, worried about whether he's going to make it home in time to see his mother before she dies. He's definitely thinking that, hey, maybe I shouldn't have been a criminal. because he says, I had spent more than half a lifetime in a worthless, dangerous profession. If I had stayed in school in 8 years of study, I could have been an MD or a lawyer. Now here I was, slick but not smart, in a cell. I was past 40 with counterfeit glory in my past and no marketable training, no future. I had been a bigger sucker than a square mark. All he loses is scratch, and I had joined a club that suckered me behind bars 5 times. Some of the interviews with him that are, they sort of piece together original interviews in Iceberg Slim Portrait of a Pimp. He touches on that, and he does seem to have at least a certain amount of conflict over the fact that people are using this book, Pimp, as looking exclusively at the mid and first half of the book and not what he has to say in the latter part of the book.
Chris Rock said something in that movie that really struck me. He gives this book out to everybody he works with when he's in a movie or something. And I'm like, why? Which part of it are you saying is worth sharing? You know, and it just, that's the unsettling thing. The lingering distaste in my mouth about it all is how this book, like some other popular books, have been misconstrued and distorted into being the opposite of their intention. Nonetheless, Beck made a shitload of money off this book telling the story.
I mean, that's kind of an interesting point.
Holloway Publishing Company made a lot of money off of it.
Yeah, because in the documentary, they talk about how they shortchanged their black authors. And I mean, that experience alone is an interesting part of the equation, you know, that
he got out of the pimping game where he was his own boss and in absolute control. And he ended up being in the publishing game where he gets fleeced by white society. So the thing he tried to avoid is essentially unavoidable if you stop playing by your own rules.
Yeah, there's a ton to unpack in this book. And I mean, obviously we've looked at a few things. There's scholars and authors and artists who have essentially made a career of unpacking what Robert Beck has written. And, you know, we're certainly not going to do it justice in a 1-hour podcast. So I would encourage, you know, I think there's a few things in a more, you know, maybe we can start wrapping this up here, Justin, but I think there's a few things that we can bring out of this, looking at this from the crime fiction perspective. One, I think this is I would say a must read for someone who is trying to expand their understanding of, I don't want to say underbelly, but the 20th century American street experience. Like, I think that's critical. Sure. I think a writer can learn a lot from the language in this book. Mm-hmm. I think it's an important read if we're trying to understand parts of Black culture, and particularly if you're interested in the origins of hip hop and rap. What else can we get out of this book, Justin?
Nothing.
Well, you know, that in a weird sense, there's some truth to that though, Justin, because I saw, and maybe this is where I start getting a little ranty about this book, but I watched a few interviews with modern day pimps through, if you're familiar with the YouTube channel Soft White Underbelly, he does a lot of, I would call, street level interviews with people who live sort of outside of the margins of you know, quote unquote normal society. Some of that is prostitutes and pimps. Some of those are drug addicts. Some of those are other people who just don't fit the normal, you know, quote unquote normal mode of American society. And I watched a few of these interviews with pimps, and I wouldn't say that a lot has really changed from what Iceberg Slim says in this book. And in fact, one of them, I'm not sure that he actually comes out and says it, but it certainly seems like he's alluding to pimp as a model for what he does. And I think these modern interviews are interesting to see that it's still a mode of manipulation. And that's kind of where I see, you know, what Beck is saying at the end of his book is I could have done these other things. And it's like that same skill set, you could use it for good, as his mom actually suggests early on in the book. Hey, why don't you be a criminal defense attorney? You'd be great at it.
He can work with the people he knows and likes, these people from the streets, but actually help them rather than continue to suffer with them.
There's so many things in which the same skill set could be used. But on the other hand, it also comes across to me as the same sort of sleazy skill set that you hear from, I don't know, like people who've got a get rich quick scheme or a real estate opportunity, or a used car salesman, or the slimy lawyer, or any of these other manipulators. And I think that's what is so unsettling to me about both what he describes and sort of this pimp experience. Yet it's not the sex work. Sex work should just be legalized and let's be over it, done with it. It's the manipulation that's the disgusting part here.
Yeah. The gaslighting, the control freakery, it's just shit that it's unacceptable then, it's unacceptable now, and we should get beyond it. I read some articles about the H word, like the word hoe and whores and sex workers, and the implications of violence in the mythical pimp, and trying to understand what does pimping look like now. There was an interesting article done by DePaul College of Law in 2010. They actually interviewed 25 ex-pimps in the Chicago area, and over 75% of the pimps were non-white. 28% of them were female, which is interesting. Many of them self-identified as having experienced physical abuse growing up, childhood sexual assault, and domestic violence. These are things that obviously Robert Beck mentions in his own story. These are people that not necessarily are just looking for a way to make a living. They're also experiencing deep traumas themselves, many of them.
I do think if this is a book that you can read and not feel that it's going to be too triggering or excite you into being a pimp, then I think this is worth reading because of its place in American, let's not say crime fiction, but crime writing of the 20th century. I think that's where it fits best. This is a true crime story that tells us about lived experience in the streets of the United States. Love it or hate it, this is what Iceberg Slim went through.
And if you don't know who Iceberg Slim is or didn't know, if you don't know who Donald Goines is, if you've never heard of Holloway House, then, well, you're in light company. I also didn't know well or barely knew of any of these folks. It's integral that we recognize it and put it on the pedestal as being one of these key moments in crime writing history, as it was a critical moment in American history. And do yourself a favor by at least reading Iceberg Slim, checking out Donald Goines, just immersing yourself in this space if you're unfamiliar with it, because it is important and it fills in a key puzzle piece that we do ourselves a disservice by leaving out.
Yeah, that's a good point, Justin, because this is a book where what most of Americans probably, if you said the word pimp and an image comes into their mind, that is being defined essentially by this book, or an extension from that. If you've ever heard, Pimpin' Ain't Easy or any number of songs, what's the origins of that? It's coming from this book.
It's not very common that we come across areas in crime fiction where Kurt or I are like, like maybe at the beginning when we were first fleshing out this podcast, everything was new. We were trying to go in blind and open to all of it. And now it's like Dash Hammett and Raymond and all these dudes. And then we're trying to figure out who were the key players, who were the key black writers, who were the key women writers going international. Well, we're now coming back around and trying to fill in these gaps. And this was a crucial gap. So do yourself a favor, check it out, talk about it, think about it. Grapple with it, because it's not easy. There's some really critically important stuff in this book. There's so much influence, and there's also some real fucking difficult, shitty stuff in this book that's hard to, swallow. But hey, that's crime fiction. There's a lot of shitty stuff in crime fiction going all the way back to the 1920s.
And a good example of, I don't know, maybe this is not exactly underground literature, but certainly a literature that exists outside of maybe, your suburban library or Barnes and Noble booksellers.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I think that was one thing I did want to point out before we end the show, that this book was not sold in the mainstream. It was not, yes, now you can order it through Amazon or whatever, but this is a book that was sold at liquor stores, at corner stores, and places that literature was not typically sold. A lot of copies were sold in that way. That's an interesting thing, that it's a book not just about being a hustler, but a book that is hustled in a different way that literature was sold in America. Just a really interesting bit of American history.
When Justin Giffords was talking about putting together his biography, at one point he was trying to find these books, but he couldn't find them. They're not accessible. Like buying these paperback copies of early Going books and early Iceberg Slim books, you don't see them, they don't exist until the rise of eBay. And then he went to eBay and he's able to find these obscure books in somebody's basement, in the back of some store. Somebody gets a copy from somebody who died. So he was on a treasure hunt finding these rare copies of a book that sold millions. So it goes to show how difficult it can be even for somebody who's actively searching them out, at least back in the day. Now with the internet, now with the rise of Amazon and these other virtual publishers, we have access at our fingertips.
So if you want a book that is going to challenge you and is influential, I would definitely check out the work of Iceberg Slim and Pimp. And so thank you for, I guess, to the listeners for struggling along with this book with us as we try to get a better understanding. We're going to go back to fiction next time.
You know, fiction's easy. We can just talk however we want about the structure. We have a nice little shape to the way we go about talking about fiction. This one was challenging. I'm glad we got through. How about future episodes? We now have a roadmap that'll take us at least through 80 episodes and maybe beyond. But episode 71 is our next one. We're going to hang out with James Salas. He's a guy we never featured, and we're going to read and discuss Drive. How do folks reach us, Kurt?
Well, if you have a specific comment, you can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. There's 2 pages there, one main page for the show, and then a group. There's a small amount of discussion on there every week. And you can always go on iTunes and give us a review. I don't know if you want to review us based on this particular episode, but you can go ahead and give us a review there. We always appreciate 5-star reviews on iTunes. Other than that, we'll see you next time.
See you later, folks.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.